Hello everybody, it's Monday the 8th of June and welcome to episode 75 of the Meet the Farmers podcast with me, your host, Ben Eagle. Now, we didn't get much rain over the past few days here in Essex. Was welcome nonetheless, as I'm sure it was for all farmers and gardeners across the land. We've got a packed show today. My guest today is former sheep farmer and current BBC newsreader Gareth Barlow, who I spoke to via Zoom last week. We'll also be playing the next instalment of Guess the Crop, which I realise we haven't played for a few weeks. Before all that though, let's take a look at the news stories from the past week.
In the news.
In the news this week, coronavirus and the lockdown continues to dominate headlines, including in the countryside, as lockdown restrictions ease further, allowing people to gather 6 at a time in open spaces in England, 8 in Scotland, and in Wales it is 2 households gathering together with no set number of people announced. This has led to large numbers of people flocking to the coasts and countryside and creating perhaps sometimes some tension between farmers and landowners and members of the public. Farmers and landowners have been faced with multiple problems as a result, including gates left open, livestock wandering, broken fences, littering, trespass, crop damage, fire and cars blocking lanes and field entrances. Farmers are being urged to deal with the public firmly but politely and avoiding confrontation if at all possible. It's a vital time to keep reminding people of the Countryside Code. The Met Office has released data for May 2020, which has shown it to be the driest May on record in England and the second driest in Wales, with an average rainfall of 9.3mm in England and 14.3mm in Wales. But of course, a lot of places saw little or no rainfall, depending on location. These figures equate to just 17% of May averages. The annual cereals event will be available online this year due to lockdown restrictions, and it takes place on Wednesday and Thursday this week. For more information, you can visit the website, which is cerealsevent.co.uk. There are new figures available from the AHDB on dairy farmer numbers. According to the AHDB, the number of dairy farmers has fallen by more than 5% over the past 15 months, with 470 dairy farmers having left the industry since February 2019. There are now 8,380 dairy farms in Great Britain. And that is the news for now.
In the news.
It's now time for a new feature on Meet the Farmers called Meet the Farmers' Friends, in which I talk to someone involved in a connected industry to farming or who has farming links in some way. Today I'm talking to BBC journalist and newsreader Gareth Barlow, who used to be a sheep farmer before he started his broadcast career.
Meet the farmers' friends.
So there are times on this show that I have to pinch myself, and today is one of those moments. Yes, today I'm speaking to the guy who reads the news. Retired farmer turned newsreader Gareth Barlow, who is a reporter for World Service Radio and World TV, as well as a newsreader for World Service Radio and BBC Two. And he also makes rural affairs films for the News at 6 and 10 and BBC Online. Gareth, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for coming on. I assume at the moment that your workload is very COVID heavy.
Yes, we've been covering the coronavirus since early January. From mid-March onwards, that's when it really ramped up, and I've been doing entire podcasts just devoted to the coronavirus. When I read the news for the World Service, you can have an entire bulletin, less so now, but certainly a month ago, with no other stories than coronavirus.
Yeah. And you're currently living in London. What was it like making the move to the big city?
In some respects, I've kind of come back home. It's the part of me that doesn't get so much broadcasting as I'm from Reading originally.
Yeah.
But that's not as fun as saying you're from Yorkshire. Reading has a festival, the M4 and a sewage works. And I'm sure people now complain, but tell me what else is there apart from the Oracle shopping centre. I'm old enough to remember when that opened. It was very exciting. So it kind of, I spent the first 13 years in the southeast, and then moved up to Yorkshire. And then I've kind of come back, and I've brought chants and all the dropped A's. I brought those back with me. So there's a slight northern twang. But it was different. You know, I was living in rural North Yorkshire, not far from Castle Howard. You had Andrew Wilson a couple of weeks ago. I was 2 miles the opposite direction to him. And it was green and leafy. And I then moved into a 1-bedroom flat in North London.
You just mentioned you were born in Reading. Take me back to your childhood, and I'm particularly interested in where those farming influences came from, because neither of your parents were farmers.
No, in many respects, I had a very ordinary upbringing, that kind of proper nucleus family. Parents, 2 kids, and a rabbit. You know, that was all it really was. And there was nothing to say that I wanted to get into farming. Dad was in IT, my mother was in marketing. But we had friends in Kirkby Lonsdale on the edge of the North Yorkshire Cumbria border. It's, I think, now part of the Yorkshire Dales. Okay. And they had a small hill farm with massive 35s, 135s, 165s, out barns, dry stone walls. Like, if you were to get a chocolate box and paint that picture, it was Bill and Mary's farm. And we went, I think I first went when I was 6 months old, and we would then go and stay at the B&B and then became friends with them, family friends. And as I got older, Bill was in his 70s, but I would sit in the window and wait for him to wake up. You know, it's 8:30 and he's still not going. And I was ready to kind of jump on the box on the back of the 35 and go for a wander around the farm. And I just fell in love with it. It was just the antithesis to everything that you had in Reading and suburbia. And so I'd come back and I'd insist. I was really cool. I would insist that the parents left part of the lawn to grow long because I needed to cut and make hay, which I would then feed to the rabbit. It was the world's smallest hay yield you've ever seen, but to me it was like a massive farm. And it just stuck. And then when we moved to Yorkshire when I was 13, it was like rural idyll on my doorstep. And I started working on the neighbour's farm, and just one thing led to another. And then I bought some sheep.
Yes, let's talk about sheep. Let's turn to that. How and when and why did you start with sheep?
My parents always told me, always be yourself. And sometimes I've probably taken that too far. when I was 17, I sold my Xbox like none of my friends were doing. And my grandfather came up from Reading, and we went over to the Yorkshire Dales. And I bought 6 rare breed Hebridean sheep for £35 a head.
Are you selling Hebrideans?
Yeah, you know, again, many of my neighbours are thinking, what on earth has he done? Like, I know he's colourblind, but why has he gone for black sheep? At least guy, a shade of white. But I just had fallen in love with it. I guess Bill had a sheep farm. That's all I really knew. And I was 17. I was like 5'7" and kind of 10 stone wet through. Like, there was no way I could be wrestling some Charolais cattle or anything like that. And so it was, what do I have land for? Well, the neighbours had just got rid of their llamas, and I'd taken on their little paddock. I had enough money, because they were £35 a head, to buy half a dozen sheep. And from my understanding, which was fairly thin at that point, they were resistant to a lot of things I didn't know what they were, and they seemed pretty hard to kill. There was kind of foot rot and fly strike and all these things apparently they didn't really suffer from. And a couple of people, you might not do too badly with them. So I think it was inevitable. I think it was inevitable that it was going to happen at some point. What happened there on after, I don't think was always planned. I think on occasions, kind of through the business, etc., I was playing catch up. But I would never change it for the world. It was the start of an incredible 6-7 year journey that kind of has led me to be sat here in North London today reading News of the World Service. I can pin all of my career for the last 13 years now back to those 6 sheep turning up.
Yeah, take me through those 6 years of how the flock grew, because during that time as well, you also got butchery experience and you spent some time working in an abattoir as well. So you saw right the way through. Yes,
and failed university as well, which was neatly slipped in there. I think I was the only person at Durham doing zoology who had a flock. No, I was the only person who had a flock of sheep. So it was 17, at the same time as the sheep turning up. They came in the September. School insisted we did work experience, as everybody does. And so I was like, well, who do I know that has a farm? I'm obsessed with farming. Well, the neighbours do. But Prince Charles has a farm. I know that much for a fact. So I wrote to Prince Charles and said, look, I want to do work experience on your farm. And unsurprisingly, he didn't write back. And I'm quite impetuous and a little bit ballsy. So I wrote a covering letter saying, you didn't respond. I would appreciate even a no, if you could take the time to kind of have the honour to write back to me. And they did. A couple of weeks later, this letter comes through the parents' front door, with many stamps and seals on the front, and come down for 2 weeks work experience. So I had these kind of 2 weeks work experience down on home farm in Tetbury in Gloucestershire, which, there was everything from veg boxes through to organic cattle, Ayrshire cattle being milked, through to a great big arable enterprise and Hebridean sheep.
Yep.
And so that was quite formulaic, I guess. And at the end of it, they said, you're the only person to have written twice. We thought we'd shut you up and make you go away by saying yes. But do you want to come back and we'll pay you next time and you can spend your summer? So my summer, before going to university, I left my IT father and marketing mother in charge of my flock of 6 sheep, and then went and worked on the farm down in Gloucestershire. And that's how I saved for university. Right. And then the flock carried on going whilst I was at Durham. I'd go back on the weekends and do all kind of the big jobs on all 6 sheep. And then during the week, my parents would keep an eye on it. The neighbours who owned the little field, they checked them every day as well. So there's always people going by. And so university was not my bag. It was the wrong course. It was the wrong thing. Everything was wrong. But I stuck it out for a year and then left and thought, well, I'll go to Reading or Newcastle or even Harper Adams and do agriculture. I'll take a year out and I'll go and do farming because that's really what I want to do.
Yeah.
And I had a friend who was a butcher at Castle Howard, big stately home with farm shop, etc. to the side of it. And I needed some meat. And I remember going in with my mother in the October of 2009. And she said, oh, Richard, I need to get him a job. He's taken up all the space in the house. And he looked at his new boss and they said, well, we're looking for someone to come and work here in the butchery. And Richard looked at Jeff, the boss, with a kind of look of, well, he wouldn't sell his grandmother. And I started the next day. And I'd never butchered anything in my life. And that was the start of 3 years of butchering there. By that point, there was about 20 sheep kicking about, and I had a few more lambs than I could fob off onto friends and family. So I said to Jeff, well, take a couple. So, well, they know normal Charolais Texel Cross or whatever. Why do I want yours? I'm like, oh, they taste great. And he was convinced, and so he took a few. And he was like, oh, have you got any more? No, I don't have any. But I'm sure I can get more. Like,
can you get more?
I can, I'm sure I can find some. And that was really the start of the business side of it. And I found some more sheep and I, killed those and brought them to the butchery. Well, have you got more? And I found more, and all of a sudden kind of tapped into the fact we were onto a good thing. Well, someone said, we need to go and get restaurant customers. So Andrew Pern, who runs the Star Inn at Hareham, a 1-star Michelin restaurant and pub, I knew of a person that knew of him who got me an introduction. I took a side of lamb with me. And at the end of the meeting, he said, well, what do you want? I said, well, I want an order. Fine, well, I'll take 2. And that was then the start of that. And he then gave me a contact list and said, try these people. And one thing led to another. And over the course of those 6 years, the flock grew from 6 to about 600. I went from renting an acre field to 2 units of about 150 acres between them, and then a couple of little paddocks where you could put the tups in, during the summer when you needed rid of them. And I was supplying Marcus Waring, 2-star Michelin-star restaurant in Knightsbridge, through to pubs that were taking shoulders for stews and pies, through to Prince Charles had some mutton delivered to his private residence up in Scotland as well. And I was working at the butchery and the abattoir I used to go to. Come and work for us. I was like, well, I'm not doing too badly at the butchery. We'll reduce the slaughter costs. Oh, really? How much by? And my initial slaughter costs were £21 a head. And by the time I ended up working there, they were down to £5.
Wow.
And I was being paid to kill my own lambs. And it just financially made sense. And then for the story, you could go to a restaurant customer and say, I helped this ewe give birth. I've fed this lamb. I've looked after it. I've slaughtered it in the most compassionate, professional way possible. Yep. I've butchered it. And now I've had here with a box of lamb ready to deliver to you. And if you could get them to buy into me, which thankfully all bar one that I ever approached did, you could then assure them of the entire provenance of the product. And it was a great story. It was the black sheep of the family selling black sheep to interesting and quality restaurants. And it just worked.
Yeah, well, Jess, I mean, it is a great story, but also you could have a great story and not be able to present it as well. And clearly, that's something that you're really good at. Is that something you've developed over time, or is it something that you had from quite a young age?
I'm thankfully part Irish, and I think that has given me the gift of the gab. I think that certainly helps. It's a lot better than it was. I first Charlotte Smith came for Farming Today in March 2010, and the audio is still online. And the voice that I have now is thankfully very different to the voice of 10 years ago.
Oh, I should have dug it up. Is
Yeah,
it still out there somewhere?
I'll send it to you. I'm that
Brilliant.
cruel to myself. I certainly wouldn't be reading the news with the voice of Gareth Barlow, the 20-year-old sheep farmer. I was fortunate that Farming Today came every month for a year and just did a radio diary. And it got to a point sometimes when they didn't have anybody to send. So can you record your own and send it up? And Country File came, the press came in Farmers Weekly, the Guardian, Farmers Guardian, etc. So I just had lots of opportunity to practice.
Yeah,
And I guess people cut you slack, don't you? Because you're a 20-year-old sheep
yeah.
farmer who isn't a broadcaster. So if you fluff, it doesn't matter, or if you don't sound great, it doesn't matter. And thankfully, producers are always kind with the edits. So I was just fortunate to have quite a lot of time to practice and have exposure.
Yeah, and in hindsight, I suppose that experience was pretty valuable for where you are now.
Oh, totally, totally. And I'd never considered broadcasting ever
Yeah.
until Charlotte came for that first interview. And I remember them leaving the farm, 20 sheep or whatever I had at that point, and saying to my family, that's the job I want to do. And I was just about 20, like, that's the job I want to, never considered it. And it took
Yep.
4 or 5 years until I eventually got there. But without that, I don't know what I'd do. I'd probably still be farming.
Yeah. So January 2014, that's the time when you sold up and I mean you joined the BBC ultimately. But take me, I'm interested in the sort of few months before that and you coming to that decision of that transition. What was going on for you then?
I always knew I wanted to do it. And I think there was that combination as well of kind of looking at where I was at, supplying 30, 40 restaurant customers, fairly decent flock size. And I would buy in sheep from as far north as Aberdeen and as far south really as Reading. So whilst there was 600 at any one time, there might be a few thousand through the farm over the course of the year. But you also looked and went, it's, as many small-scale sheep farmers know, there's not all that many opportunities to get away from this. And I had a very dear friend of mine who I went to school with, George, would come on one of his days off each week from work and come and help me on the farm. But that was the only help you'd get. And I knew I wanted to do it, but I was thinking, well, is it going to be 5 years or 10 years before you get to a point that financially the farm's big enough that you could employ someone to either run it for you or even just for a week? There was conflict there in my mind as to what to do. And did I want to kind of get to maybe 30 before it was possible, or even later, or if at all? Mm. And my parents, for my birthday that year, said, if you want, we'll buy you flight tickets to get away. Between 17 and 24, the longest I'd had off the farm was 3 days. I'd never gone anywhere apart from at New Year with a couple of friends to the Lake District, have a few pints, 2 days later come back and check the sheep. And they said, do you want to have some flights? We'll look after the farm for a week. We'll keep an eye on it. Your landlord will give us a hand as well. He's more than happy to help. Just have a break. And I walked back in the door I went to Switzerland to where we'd gone when we were kids as a family. And I walked back in the door and said, I'm selling the farm. Wow. And my mother has subsequently said in recent years, I knew that was what we were going to say as soon as you walked in. And it was just that opportunity to sit and go, what am I going to do? And I've been fortunate with Radio York, the local radio station, that I built a bit of a relationship with them. And I'd done a couple of bits, with Farming Today. I thought, well, maybe there's an opportunity. Sold the farm. The last sheep went just after Christmas Day on December 2013. And then I realized that it was really quite hard to start in broadcasting. And the truth is, I never went back to the farm for 2 years. I couldn't walk through those fields. I couldn't do it. I thought I'd made a massive mistake. And upsettingly, my landlord died, and I never really got to maintain the relationship with him because of my own reluctance to go back and visit what I'd had. I was fortunate. I'd gone from being, I think, possibly one of the largest rare breeds meat suppliers in the UK to someone who was now sending out their CV, but he didn't have a CV in broadcasting. And it was a hard year. 2014 was tricky, and I eventually got some freelance work with the BBC, but I was answering the phones and I was making cups of tea and coffee and being paid £38 for a half-day shift.
Yeah.
And I was 23 and doing work experience again, and I honestly thought I'd made the wrong choice. But thankfully, persistence and I guess that dogged determination that wrote to Prince Charles twice paid off, and one thing led to another, and it's the career has developed.
That is definitely the word that's coming into my head a lot with your story, is that persistent spirit.
I always used to think when the restaurant customers said no, it wasn't a permanent no, it was just no at the moment. And I would go back in 6 weeks or 6 months and see if you want some more. I think very, very few occasions are doors completely closed onto you. And you also need luck. Heavens, I've had loads of it. I've had loads of support from colleagues and supporters and friends and family and restaurant customers and businesses as well. But you at the same time, like, no one can light the fire within you. You've got to do that yourself. And I was very fortunate. I had a maverick boss. I don't think he'd mind that description when I first started at Radio York. And I'd been there a couple of months, and he sat me down and went, I don't really know anything about you, but I know stuff about everybody else in this office, but you keep kind of avoiding me or avoiding my gaze. Well, who are you? What do you do? And I explained the farming background. He's like, well, this is a massive rural station. Our heartland is the North York Moors, the Yorkshire Dales, the Vale of Pickering, Rydal, etc. We don't do very much. Go and make me 2 radio packages every week for use on Saturday breakfast about rural stories. Fantastic. It's Wednesday, you've got plenty of time. So I've never made a radio package. I don't know what to do. You'll learn. And that was like the August, September. And by the November, he looked at me and went, the packages aren't enough. I want a weekly radio program looking at all things rural affairs and farming, etc. You'll start 4th of January. I said, I don't know how to present a radio program. You'll learn. I'll tell you where you're going wrong. And he did. But he also let me make mistakes. And I was just fortunate that I met him. And that was then the start, really, of the proper broadcasting career.
With that rural affairs hat on, your farming background must play to your advantage there.
Yes.
In terms of contacts and approaching people, and when you're on site as well, being able to speak the same language in many ways. Speak
the same language, and I think just prove that you understand, and there's a degree of empathy, because it's about building relations, and you have to build sometimes quite an intimate relationship with somebody in a very short period of time. Yeah. I made a film last spring about mental health and suicide in farm workers. And,
I remember that.
Went up.
It was a really good piece.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. And we were very, very fortunate that people spoke so candidly. But went up to a father and son dairy farming team in Perth direction in Scotland. You're only there for a day at the most. You can't take up residency and live their lives and slowly ingratiate yourself with them. But within a few hours, you've got to be able to ask questions that sometimes, do elicit very strong emotions from people, and have a degree of empathy and relationship, and to be able to go for a bit of a wander around the farm first and talk about what's going in the Keenan feeder, or talk about how the dry cows are, or whether they're all year round calving or spring or autumn block or whatever, and have a bit of an understanding so they feel slightly more comfortable before you then get down to some quite intense topics. It certainly helps. I think the thing to always remember, though, is that you're asking questions on behalf of the audience. And unlike a industry publication or even Farming Today, if you're doing it for BBC News in general and the 6 or 10 o'clock news, you're asking it for effectively the entire demographic of the UK. Yep. So don't fall into the trap too much of talking about what's going in the easy feeder or what you're doing for spring or autumn block calving. You've kind of got to have that capacity to ask those questions, but still try and ask them in a way that is revealing and accessible for the average Joe. But no, it certainly helped. It certainly helped. So it's dug me up a few holes on occasions as well, when I think people have been reticent, and then seeing kind of you get out of the car and then you go, well, when I did this, oh, okay. And it sometimes breaks down barriers.
And when did you decide to move down south and take up the World Service job?
I don't think there was ever a particular moment. And I had always said I never wanted to work in news. I said it was boring, that who would want to do that, that it's just repetitive, it's the same stuff hour after hour after hour. And I always wanted to do long form and documentaries and carry on doing rural affairs and doing my programme. I think there was a little bit that I was very fortunate that it was my own programme, but it then was all you ever thought about. And if you wanted to take a week's holiday from work, then you had to produce 2 programs that week and make sure one was pre-recorded in the system. Or if you wanted a fortnight off, then you would do 3 programs and really making a 4th for the week you came back.
Yeah.
And so it was all encompassing. And, I kind of fancied a new challenge and a change. And I met somebody. I'd gone down a training course at Broadcasting House in central London. I'd arrived early. I was sat having a cup of tea, and this person goes and makes a cup of tea and kind of looks at you and smiles with that hi. And I did that British kind of, oh, hi, and then carried on looking down at my notebook. And this guy starts walking towards me, and I didn't know anybody. He said, hey, are you Gareth Barlow? Yes. He's like, I follow you on Instagram.
Fantastic.
Okay. He said, oh, lovely. What are you doing? And I kind of explained. And he never said who he was. And I said, look, I'm terribly sorry, but I never caught your name, thinking full well you didn't tell me, but I'm going to find out.
Yeah.
He said, oh, I'm Paul. I'm the editor of presentation at the BBC World Service. And I instantly sat up a lot straighter than I was up until that moment. And what on earth do you do? Follow me on Twitter. And, his Twitter handle didn't have his job in it. Otherwise, I would have paid more attention at the time. But he then became supportive and kind of suggested opportunities and avenues. And a job came up working for one of the programs down on the World Service. And I thought, well, let's have a go. And I turned up and I job interview in one of the BBC's tiny, tiny little meeting rooms, which are like hen's teeth. Securing one of those is almost impossible. And when you do, pre-COVID, you pack as many people in as possible because you just make the most of the opportunities. So you're in a tiny meeting room, almost shoulder to shoulder with the panel of 3 who are interviewing you. I say, and my bosses disagree with me here, but I claim we spent more time talking about butchery, cured meats, and an abattoir than we did about broadcasting and the questions about the world and the World Service. They say that there was more time spent about that. I guess they have to. But I remember my boss apparently then walking down to the office going, I think we're about to employ a slaughterman. And people at the department being like, what? And she was like, I think you'll like him. I think he'll be fine.
That is fantastic.
And she said in the interview, are you happy working in an office in central London? I said, it's a great office. Have you seen the place? Like, it's the biggest broadcasting centre on the planet. I'll be delighted to. So it was, again, just things happened, events happened, and I met people and kind of it all fell into place, thankfully.
I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of chat generally about change at the BBC and changing broadcasting generally. Do you think in terms of farming communications and rural communications, that we will see any major change in the way that stories are broadcasted, or perhaps the nature of the stories themselves?
I think we already have seen lots of change in the fact that people like yourself or anybody on Twitter or social media is broadcasting themselves already. And if I think back to when I started farming in 2007, there were people doing it, but it has massively ramped up in scale and also quality. So I think there's that change. People can kind of take on that mantle themselves. There is always going to be the desire for content. Let's be honest. I think food is the only thing that we all do that unifies us. But I think the challenge is that void between food and farming, especially within the public. So I think that's the challenge is trying to make that connection and bridge that gap. I don't think there's going to be radical change, and I hope this doesn't come back out in 5 years' time and everyone laughs at me, because I think people are doing a good job. It's all the constituent parts are there. There's content on print publications, there's radio, there's television, there's social media, there's Open Farm Sundays, there's all the channels already exist. I don't think there's a massive gap in the arsenal of communication. We work in news and people often say to me, well, why don't you cover X, Y, or Z? Is it actually news? Is it new or is it a feature? And that's the thing that we have to try and balance and explain. Farming Today or Country File can do a feature.
Yep.
If I've got a running order and Laura Koonsberg is talking about Brexit, does my piece of news effectively...
People talk about Brexit anymore?
Yeah. No, not at all. What Brexit? But but there are huge juggernauts of stories, coronavirus, for example. Yeah. There is only so much airtime. You've got to pitch against those. And if it's a feature, it's not going to happen. From my perspective, we won't make as much content in news as people will like us to from the farming community, but we will always try and do it as much as we can when news crops up. But there is still so many other supporting outlets that I think hopefully will then kind of maintain the narrative 24/7.
Where do you hope Gareth Barlow's life will be in 10 years' time within the journalism world? What are your aspirations?
I really don't know. just turned 30, which kind of is terrifying because my next big birthday is 40, which is quite upsetting. But I kind of look back at my 20s, and I started my 20s as a person with 20 sheep in rural North Yorkshire. And I kind of ended my 20s. A couple of years ago, I was in Bangladesh covering the Rohingya refugee crisis with an armed escort on the border with the Burmese military. You know, and that was within a decade. Where the next 10 years will go, I have no idea, and I'm not enough of a gambling man to put any money on it. I want to carry on doing stuff on rural affairs. We did a great series last summer, the Focus on Farming, which we managed to kind of raise profile, you know, across news and across different platforms.
That was incredible to get that whole week.
Yes, we were very fortunate. I will shout out Jonathan Munro, who commissioned it. He discovered me on a work email and said, I didn't know there was a farmer in the building, let's have a chat. And he said, well, what do you think we do? I said, well, we do an awful lot on veganism and the environment, and I think sometimes we do too much on both, and there's an awful lot more that we could be talking about. I said, fine, we'll do a week in the summer. And you know, it would have been nice to have done something similar this year. Obviously, coronavirus is put paid to that. But I want to carry on doing rural affairs. But I would be keen to go and have some challenges abroad. I'm moving to Brussels for 6 months in October, but it'll be fascinating to go and parachute yourself into somewhere like, I don't know, Myanmar, and just go, wow, what on earth am I doing here? What's next? What are the stories?
Yeah, well, Gareth, thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been brilliant to have you on here, and a really interesting insight into what it's like actually being a newsreader.
Pleasure. Well, the only insight I can give you is just don't swear. If you don't swear, you'll be just fine.
Grand. Stay safe and well. Cheers.
Cheers, buddy. Thank you.
Meet the farmer's friends.
Gareth Barlow. Huge thanks to Gareth for coming on the show. Now, before we go, here are the clues for today's Guess the Crop.
Time to guess the crop. Just tell me what the type of crop is.
Yes, this is Guess the Crop, the game in which I ask you to message me your answer through Twitter, Instagram or email. That's at mtf_podcast or thinkingcountry@gmail.com. I'll give you 3 clues and the answer will be a crop of some kind from anywhere in the world. The person with the most correct answers by the end of the year will receive a special mystery prize which will be posted to them. Your clues today are: number 1, it is a pulse; number 2, it's a key ingredient in hummus; and number 3, India grow around 2/3 of the global output of this crop. Message me your answer on Twitter, Instagram or email.
Time to guess the crop. Just tell me what the type of crop is.
Next week on the show, I'll be speaking to the current chair of the National Federation of Young Farmers Clubs, Dewey Parry. Big thanks to my guest today, Gareth Barlow, and also to the show supporters, the Mercer Family Charitable Foundation. Thank you very much for listening to this episode of Meet the Farmers. Please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening so that you never miss another episode, and I'll see you next week.